Hi, Misha here. And recently, we really dove into the history of the Dutch FAL variant, the Netherlands, colloquially Holland, and really talked about what made this different, why it beat out the AR-10. The gentleman I got this from, who basically built it for me, one of the kind of terms of our agreement was that I would shoot it and do a shooting video. Alrighty. The Dutch FAL, first shots. That first video was just about the history and really nitpicking on the specs. This one is going to be shooting this FAL, basically a 50-00 type, 7.62 NATO, 308. We'll run a few different types of ammo through it. And really it's just a hanging out on the porch video. Nice evening out at the cabin. Thought we would just go over a couple of quick ways to identify a Dutch FAL, the big differences. Talk about my impressions, how it shot. And just tell a few stories about how I got into FALs and how that connects to AKs, Kalashnikovs, because there's actually quite a connection between the two guns and kind of the types of people, myself included, that are into them. But as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Also check out some of our older FAL videos. Been kind of going back through them. Recently looked at the Israelis, the Germans. And if you'd like to help support us, check out the link to Patreon. On the first few rounds through this guy. And she even held open. Cool. Of course, this is not 100% true original FAL from the Netherlands. They were all technically capable of full auto, even if all of them in service had the beaked selector, so it was just fire and safe. But in theory, they could be converted. They had the out-of-battery safety, blah, blah, blah. They were a sear cut receiver. And anyway, even if they were importable, the Dutch actually destroyed most of their guns that they didn't either give away to allies or put in museums. No, this is a build, but it's on a DSA forged Type 1 receiver, which is really the only correct receiver for this. I don't think they ever did a Type 2. They definitely did not do a Type 3. But the rest of the parts, for the most part, are either FN or Artillery Inrichting, AI. AI made a lot of the parts for the Dutch FAL, but actually the first half of production was made in Belgium, and all of the 53,000 were built on Belgian receivers, and I believe it was the bolt was always Belgian made. So FN parts where need to be, Dutch parts where they can be, especially when it comes to the unique identifiable features. Now, in the first video, I really delved into the nitty-gritty, but let's just look at a handful of things to quickly ID and what sets this apart from, say, a G1, a BGS gun, a STG-58. You get the idea. And really, one of the first is pretty apparent. We have a wood buttstock. That, in and of itself, lots of guns do in the FAL series. But what gets this one different is the fixed side sling bracket, sling mount here. That's pretty much unique to the Dutch FAL. Keep on. But then we have what's known as the Holland rear sight. Now, you might be rather familiar with this windage only adjustable rear sight because it appears on a lot of paratroopers and other models later on. but it's called the Holland sight for a reason. It started here. So, cool. And the idea was just durability and also something that soldiers wouldn't be messing with. Another unique feature is the magazine release here. It is quite distinctive to this version. It's more like the so-called inch pattern than it is the metric, even though they're interchangeable. But it's its own deal, and it might be one of my favorite, if not my favorite, FAL type mag cap. Enjoying this Dutch style mag release too. That's pretty nice. Another very easy identifiable feature, especially if you're looking at photos, that might be the most easy to identify: the hooded front sight. As far as I know, when it comes to military, full-scale production type guns, this was the only model to feature this. And this was something specified by the Dutch trials when they were doing it. At least they wanted a covered front sight, a protected sight. It needed to be adjustable, yada yada. Either way, very unique part to this gun. And then finally, the flash hider. The Holland FAL was one of the first to have the modern Type C. And it really is a transition from kind of the Austrian Stoll type used on the Steyr SUG-58 with the rings, grenade back here. But instead of having the prongs out front, it has the ports, the slots, like the Type C, and it's internally threaded for a blank fire device. When these were typed out and adopted in 1961-62, this style was just coming into service, and you can tell it's the earlier style because of the location of the wrench flats. So even though Dutch FALs are pretty uncommon to rare in America, those are 5 things that, make them stand out. Other features, pretty standard for the day, although kind of like with the flash hider, this is one of the first to use this style of carry handle. It would later be adapted in sight form for the other guns. The pistol grip's a little skinnier than usual. The takedown nut actually has a slot in it for easy disassembly, and the handguards are unique, and I think this is a pretty creative feature. They have these rivets or dimples in here to keep the gas regulator from over-rotating and just spinning to stop. So they're actually unique to this version, although they're very, very close to the late-style metal handguards used by, say, the FN, FAL G1s and STG-58s and all that. Although they do have the unique paint finish versus bluing or phosphating. And some people kind of wonder why they did these metal handguards. But for the time and the material available to FN, it made perfect sense. Your earliest FALs had wood handguards, quite naturally. And many would continue to use wood. For example, the Australian Lithgow L1A1 used it to the very end. But when they wanted to go to a folding light bipod, and they tried to do wood, it was too thin, under here. And polymer wasn't up to the task at the day and time in the 50s. So they went to sheet steel. For the time it worked. It let them stay relatively light, very slim, especially folded up. And was durable enough, although they do, dent pretty easily. And yes, they do allow for heat to be transmitted more. But then again, a lot of FALs were being used in Europe, cooler climates, and even if they were technically select fire capable, most militaries were effectively using them on semi-auto only. I'm going to try it offhand. And in some ways, it's less recoiling because you can kind of control it with your offhand. It's a little less impactful against the good old shoulder. Just because you could fire it from the bipod, and that might have been preferred in certain situations, even this version can absolutely be fired offhand and was intended to, rifle doctrine of the time and era. So the Dutch was not unique in that general layout and configuration. I would say the sights and the sling arrangement were the most unique. Otherwise, it took standard metric mags. I really do like the charging handle. It is non-reciprocating. I like that it's on the left, so you can leave your main hand on. It's actually very nice to use with the bipod. It does have the large foot release. The ergonomics are very nice to me for the FAL. In fact, the first person that ever put an FAL in my hand was J. Ray's father, Doc. He was building them, and I've told this story before, but went over to his garage. He was working on a South African R1. He had a West German G1. He had a couple of pre-bands too, but he was just doing kit builds. Back then, the kits were commonly available. Just thinking, and I remember I was just sitting there, and they put one in my hands, and I was just holding it like this, and I thought, that's a rifle. That's a real rifle. And then this big old mag, wide, not so much large capacity. This felt like a mag for something like a Barrett. I mean, it just, to me at the time, it had that substantial feel, and it has just a very no-nonsense, no-flash feel. And that's kind of the FAL. It's a very traditional design in a lot of ways. Just like the M1 Garand and stuff. It's a traditional forged steel, wood. Even the polymers they use aren't like modern polymers. They have a much more utilitarian feel. But from the moment he put one in my hands, I just kind of knew this rifle spoke. And thanks to their highly adjustable gas regulator, you can mostly tune these to run anything within reason. Now let's try it with some hollow points one of the Patreons sent me. Not only did that hole open again, that was actually quite a bit hotter. And if you're building an FAL, setting headspace is easier than a lot of other rifles. The proper way to do it is to barrel your action, get your bolt, take your extractor out, and then check your headspace, and then order the proper locking shoulder here. I know some guys will try to take a oversized shoulder and file it down. You can do that. However, I have serious concerns about the heat treat because the way FN did these, the outermost surface was harder, and then the inner core was softer to give it flex, because if it was all just hard through and through, it would crack or shatter. So if you file through, you might break through the outer heat treat surface and get into a softer surface. That's a bit theoretical. I'm not going to say if you do it, you will die. No, I'm not saying that. However, it's such a cheap part, relatively speaking, and they're still available. Just do it the right way. Don't risk a rifle or your safety. This is a serious car. Metal does heat up, but not too bad. Not bad at all. But there's something about the feel to it. And you can really get into collecting them. FN was happy to customize for each nation within reason. So virtually every nation that adopted the FAL, especially early on, 50s, 60s, did their own thing. So you can really, really go from there. And we're fortunate. We've had a lot of pre-ban guns come in, and a lot of the parts kits that came in were before the 2005 barrel ban, so they still have their barrels. And we're very fortunate to have DSA, even today, as a receiver maker. I've talked about this in other videos, but they basically got their blueprints, tooling, all that from Steyr. They bought them in 90s from there. And so they're made to spec as much as can be expected. And not just DSA. We had quite a few MBEL receivers come in. We had some nice Argentine receivers, even some FNs. And we had other makers in America that weren't bad at all, like Kunin, even though they were cast for a time, they were a good cast option. And Enterprise, not bad either. And you had some like Hess that were really a pain in the neck to build with, but generally speaking, they were safe. And then you had a few like the Williams that were not safe. But that's kind of all long in the past now, I suppose. Because that's when the kits were coming in, and of course over time they've just dried up. Like I said, there's kind of a cross-section of FAL enthusiasts and AK enthusiasts, myself included. To be fair, I really got into FALs before AKs, although they weren't too far apart. But I've met a lot of guys who claim that they took a very similar path. And I think it makes sense, especially comparing the early Kalashnikovs from the 50s and 60s. It's that wood and steel look. Now, yeah, the AK went to stamped steel, but you still have forged components like the trunnion. And they're kind of, Cold War adversaries, very much with each other. They're both pretty forgiving. They're both pretty easy to work on at home, at least basic maintenance. They don't require just a ton of cleaning each. Both are absolutely iconic. I mean, before the G3 came along, this was the West's rifle. Effectively the de facto standard, except for a few outliers like the M14, the MAS 4956, the BM59. This was it. And the FAL and the AK kind of complement each other. This is a very good, powerful cartridge, although the gun's a little long and heavy. And the AK is a nice, handy gun. And 7.62x39 is great at close to medium ranges, but longer ranges, yeah. And, early AKs were actually surprisingly good quality, but, still an AK. I think it's also neat that you can collect a bunch of them from different nations and not really repeat yourself. Look, I like the AR as much as anyone, but there's only so many historical military ARs you can collect before you either get into just obscure things like the GX58, 57, or you kind of start repeating yourself, or you start really getting into minutiae about differences. And I think part of it's just what we like. But from a collector standpoint, these are really engaging, or at least they were back when the kits were coming in, because you could get a kit for $100 to $300 depending on what it was. You could get a receiver for $150 to $250 depending on what it was. And this required no riveting, no welding, basic tools. You could put one of these together that wouldn't turn into a pile of garbage in your garage, which is some basic know-how. And at the time, there was quite a helpful online community if you got stumped, or people would trade serial parts like on the Argentine guns, like the Saclata guns, or they'd help you with getting the right locking shoulder for head spacing, or they'd help you do a clone correct rifle like this one. Not shabby at all. You did good, sir. And on top of all that, back then, the classic metric steel mag was cheap. Like $5 or less for pretty good ones. When I got into them, inch mags, Imperial mags were a little more, but even those you could pick up for $10, $12 in good shape. Not quite the case anymore, is it, guys? But that's just how surplus goes. Not just these, not just AKs, but anything. When surplus is available, it's relatively affordable. But once it disappears, now, then the free market kind of determines its value. And I've noticed in the last couple of years, FALs are pretty popular. Not that they ever really fell out of popularity, but it seems like people are kind of noticing them more now. And I have pointed out in previous videos, DSA is back to doing classic FALs again, like the Cuban model I featured before. I mean, technically, DSA is the only, at least semi-official maker of the FAL in the world left. But it's really cool they're getting back to replica rifles. And this here, the Dutch, the Holland FAL, would actually be a good candidate for DSA to look into. Because if they could do the front sight, and they already make this rear sight for their Paris, just make the special mag catch, a few other things, they could get a reasonably close facsimile. And, as always, held open. But no, just had this out. You know, with the cost and value of 308 ammo these days, I'm not going to put a ton through it. But put enough to say that it runs reliably. The gas system seems to be set pretty well. Didn't have any cycling issues. The bolt held back on every round. But no, I could go on and on about my history and my enjoyment of the FAL. It's brought me hours, days, weeks, years of fun. And for someone who's kind of technically minded, mechanically minded, historically minded, there's a lot to chew on with any of these. And that's not to discount things like the SETME, the HK G3. And they definitely, absolutely have their place. I just did a whole, week-long series on the Bundeswehr guns, so I definitely appreciate them too. And I like the AR-10 that we featured in the original video with this. But there are just certain guns that speak to us. There's certain guns that never fail to excite us, even if we've had a ton of them to come through our hands. I always am interested to handle a new FAL that a friend picked up, or check one out, or take one in on trade, because there's just a lot to get into. All the different various histories. And on top of that, they're just fun to shoot. They really, really are. And you can really tune that gas to make them very, very gentle. So it didn't take a lot of convincing for me to agree to take this old girl out and run a few rounds to him here at the cabin. What do you think? What do you think of this kind of rare variant here, too? Love to talk FALs in the comments. I'm always up for it. And if you have any video suggestions for FAL stuff, lay them on me. With that, if you'd like to help support us, please check out the link to Patreon. If not, liking, sharing, subscribing, that's all great and dandy too. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.